Okay. So what I wanted to do was really to provide some sort of overview of a rights perspective in relation to the digital environment. Just so first, the changing landscape that we're all inhabiting now. 1 in 3 internet users globally is a child. So they're a very, very significant proportion of the people who are online. That the internet is now a permanent and really very central feature in the lives of children globally. And when we talk with children, they see it as absolutely integral to their, almost as integral as eating and breathing. And the data shows that children are spending more and more time online. We're witnessing the growing power and wealth of the tech industry, which I'll talk a bit more about later. Very fast developing role of AI, which is transforming everything. And there are sort of competing narratives really about the world of children online. There's the sort of protective language of fear of all of the harms that children can encounter and the need to protect children from abuse and harm in the online environment. But the counter narrative is that it's an extraordinarily creative, innovative space for children in multiple different ways through culture and relationships and networking and civic engagement and so on. So it's a very complex picture. So one of the questions really has been that given the CRC was adopted by the UN, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the UN in 1989, the same year that the World Wide Web was created, so it doesn't in any way reflect the language or the existence of the internet and the way in which it's impacted on the reality of children's existence. So there's been a lot of questions. Does that mean we need new rights, that the CRC is no longer, if you like, fit for purpose? And there are multiple rights which are affected by the online environment. In family life, we witness an enormous degree of tension, if you like, within family life about how parents negotiate access and length of time and which websites and what should be blocked and so on. It's an issue that is taking place all day, every day, if you like, in families around the world. I mean, you've been talking about mental health, but it has implications for children's mental health. It also has implications for physical health if it's taking children away from the outdoors and physical activity because they're spending time online. We know that there is significant issues around the right to protection from violence, the right to protection from all forms of exploitation. There are concerns about access to justice, that do children have any means of remedy, any means of redress, any access to justice if they are abused or hurt or damaged online, or if their data is stolen, or if they are tricked or misled by anything that's happening to them online. It's also hugely important for education, the ed tech sector producing, sophisticated, very, very appealing materials and educational tools and resources which are available online. Google is doing a huge amount of work, for example. And children themselves talk about play and leisure, culture and the arts as being a massive arena for them online. And then there are issues about freedom of expression, access to information, freedom of association, which can be strengthened and take place online, but also issues about the rights to privacy. And the rights of the 4 general principles of the Convention, non-discrimination, best interest, being heard, and optimum development are all impacted by the online environment. So it's pretty pervasive in terms of the picture of children's rights. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the international monitoring body, we had a discussion with them about what should be happening in relation to rights. And the feeling was that the CRC already fully covers everything that happens to children online, is in a sense, can be addressed by the rights that exist in the CRC. But what is needed is much more targeted and additional measures and analysis, really, of what's needed in order to give effect to children's rights in this very new and different context of the digital world. So the committee decided that they would produce what's called a general comment. A general comment is it's a report or a paper, a document, usually 10,000 plus words, where they address a particular human right or a particular issue or a particular group of children, and provide states with much elaborated guidance on how to implement the CRC in that particular context. So it decided to do a general comment on the digital environment, and I, with a group of others, worked with the committee on its development. So the idea was to help governments, because there was a lot of demand from governments. How do we deal with this? What should we be doing to protect and support children in this world? And so we produced a draft. There was a very, very wide-ranging review with states commenting, private sector, civil society organisations, human rights institutions, and so on, all fed into the final product. And there was a global consultation with children, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute. And the objectives that the committee were very clear about was what they wanted to achieve was widespread, equitable and safe access to the digital world. What they didn't want to do was define this just in terms of protection and closing down the space and seeing this as something children should be protected from. What they wanted to do was reach out and enable children to benefit from this, but to do so in a way which was safe and equitable. And it was published in 2021. So it's important, I think, to think about this isn't my graphic, but I think it sums up for me really well that what children are doing online is multiple. So the eBay is equivalent, if you like, to the Mall. YouTube is equivalent, the cultural arts and the cinema. Amazon, where you go for your books. Facebook, where you meet your friends and hang out. The library, Google is an infinite sort of library of sources of data and information. So on Twitter, where you can engage in political discourse and so on. So it's performing multiple different functions. It's important not just to see when children are on their phone, they're only doing one thing. They're doing multiple different things when they're engaging in the online environment. So we're faced with these inevitable tensions. On the one hand, the need to protect children from harm, and on the other hand, to promote and support equitable and safe, inclusive access. So the kind of problems that arise online, Sonia Livingston, who's one of the lead researchers in this field, and she was the kind of lead author when we were doing the general comment, she's characterized the kind of risks and harm in these four categories. First of all, children can be exposed to content that they don't necessarily want to receive. So they just in their day-to-day engagement online, they encounter racist abuse, unwanted pornographic material, and many children talk about that. Or it may be that they are contacted by somebody harmful who is grooming them, sexual coercion, extortion, sextortion, and so on. So this is the contact with another person which is harmful to them. Or it may be that they're engaged in conduct which is potentially harmful, engaging in online bullying, for example, or getting involved through the kind of algorithms that these tech companies utilize to drive you into particular networks and driving you into harmful communities like anorexic or suicide networks. Or they are harmed by a contract, identity theft, hacking, blackmail, and so on. So 4 different ways in which harm can arise in the online environment. And there are many, this is just some, a few fragments of some of the data. But for example, up to 300 million children have been subjected to online solicitation, unwanted sexual talk, sex requests, and so on. So you're talking about large numbers of children who are impacted in these ways. So then, you mentioned in the introduction, that there's been a huge amount of research on this and a huge amount of data, but the evidence is not only is the evidence to some extent inconsistent, but also people's interpretation of the data and what they feel are the consequences in terms of the policy implications or the legislative regulatory implications or behavioral implications do differ. So there are 3 different sort of clusters, if you like. This is an oversimplification, but so some researchers have said that there are multiple negative outcomes associated with children's online activity: emotional instability, disrupted sleep, poor language skills, and so on. But they would argue that the internet is so embedded in children's lives and children see it as so important that you can't reverse that. We have to live with that reality. So they would argue that the focus needs to be, therefore, on strengthening and empowering both children and their parents to to understand better things like the provenance of information, the status of information they find, how to protect themselves better, how to report when things go wrong, how to block the things that they don't want to see, in order you better manage usage and you diminish harm. So the focus is on the empowerment of the individual family, parents and the children within the family. Then there's the second cluster who argue that, so Jonathan Haidt, for example, is a particular proponent of this position, that there is a fundamental rewiring of children's brains that is now happening because of the amount of time and the nature of their online experiences. And that is associated with increases in depression, anxiety, self-harm and suicide rates. And he would, for example, Jonathan Haidt would track that as coinciding exactly with the period when social media, children started to engage in social media and having access to mobile phones and the rise in online gambling. And what that kind of body of people would argue is that even if the evidence is only correlative as opposed to causative, the seriousness, the impact is so serious and so irreversible, then it's too dangerous not to take preventive action now. And they would argue that there needs to be much greater age restrictions on access to social media and complete banning of phones in schools, for example, which is increasingly beginning to happen around the world. And then there's a third cluster of researchers and research which says that all the evidence in the above relies on correlation. There is no demonstrative causal relationship that has been found between phone use, social media access, and the mental health of children. And that they have looked at meta-analytic data, and that suggests that even when you reduce social media time, there is little evidence that reduces, enhances mental well-being and so on. So what they would argue predominantly is that offline vulnerability is the greater predictor of online harm. In other words, if you all have a fragile family, you have abusive family, you are living in extremely difficult or challenging or precarious situation online, you're being bullied offline or whatever, then that is the predictor of vulnerability online. So there's a highly direct relationship between offline and online vulnerability. So they would go down the approach of avoiding bans and focusing instead on how do you address the offline problems, the root causes, as they would see it, and a much stronger demand on the tech sector to introduce firewalls to enable safe spaces for children's engagement. So rather than focusing on the individual family or the individual child, they focus on the tech sector as being responsible for creating the safe environment. So looking at what children were saying in relation to all of this, when we did the general comment, we consulted with 700 children from 27 countries, and this was focus groups, not online surveys. One of the common threads that came through this, we have to have the digital environment, is absolutely fundamental. We cannot manage without it. But they were very clear they wanted much greater levels of responsibility from the tech sector to build a safe, non-exploitative, respectful environment. One UK child, I love this quote, "We want to be on the internet to learn and to share, but we're not ready for the whole of the adult world." So I think that sort of sums it up quite well. And I won't go through all these, but some of the things they elaborated, in terms of connection and continuity was positive, learning opportunities were positive, but they were felt negative about the way in which they were marketed and targeted, and very concerned about some of the generational conflicts that it promotes. They talked about fantastic sources of information, that they do fitness and dancing and Zumba online, and they do get access to mental health and indeed sexual and reproductive health rights information. So it's hugely important. A lot commented on that they spent far too much time online, that it made them have a negative self and body image, and they're very, there was a lot of awareness of the degree there is a trade-off here. You're getting access to this stuff, but that the tech companies are utilizing and commercializing your data. They're selling your data and utilizing it and so on, and that they're being targeted through the algorithmic structures that are imposed, so that they're driven in particular directions, and they were pretty aware of a lot of that. So the question then is, where does responsibility lie then in all this huge complexity? And clearly the government have a very a very strong role for introducing regulations, introducing legislation, and introducing mechanisms to hold the tech companies to account. And that's obviously a challenge. The industry itself needs to behave ethically and in the best interests of children. And civil societies and national human rights institutions have a role in terms of collecting evidence, in monitoring what's happening, advocating for much, much stronger protections for children. Professionals working with children. Some research shows that many, many professionals across medical, educational fields have very little idea really of some of the things that are going on online, what impact it's having on children. So I think there's an obligation on professionals to be more aware of what's happening. Parents clearly have a role to play in being aware of their children, speaking with their children, communicating with their children, and understanding what their children's online lives are like, so that they become somewhere children can go to if they feel at risk, or they're being harmed, or they're being targeted. And children themselves obviously have an obligation not to, to learn as much as they can about how to keep safe, but also not to harm or cause distress to other children through cyberbullying or sextortion or whatever. If you want to take a sort of child rights-based approach to this, these are some of the things that you would want to see as an outcome in the online environment, where everyone can access regardless of who they are, that they don't experience abuse of their personal privacy, that it's a place that encourages and facilitates, supports curiosity and experiment and learning and play and leisure, that it encourages children to feel they can contribute as well as being a consumer, that it encourages social, collaborative activity and engagement. It facilitates children to understand what is the nature of the commercial activity that lies behind everything that they do, and how are they being, and where are they being exploited, and doesn't place all responsibility on children to have to make those choices and have to take that self-protective measure. There's a huge onus of responsibility on the sector itself. And so they need to be consulting with children in the design and in the development, not just in order to make more profits, but in order to make it a more safe and rights-respecting environment. And I think one of the things that this doesn't just apply to children, it very much applies to adults, is that the terms and conditions, which we all sign up to all the time, one of the things that children say is that they are so detailed and so long, nobody reads them. I mean, none of us read them, we just click yes. And they were saying they should be possible to produce terms and conditions in accessible, straightforward language, so that children know what it is that they're signing up to. So really, there are no easy answers in any of this. The challenge is, how do we balance the importance of equity and access with protection from harm? That it really is imperative that we continue in engagement and dialogue with children, because they, in a sense, know best what they're doing, what they're exposing themselves to, what the risks are, what impact it's having on them. And so they are a huge source of expertise and wisdom, really, in terms of how we move forward and how we develop a more positive environment. And there needs to be much better coordinated action nationally and internationally to regulate the digital sector. I mean, they are so wealthy and they are so powerful. They are bigger, if you like, than the GDP of many states. And we can see that the EU, for example, is beginning to take action. We've got quite good regulation now in the UK with the online protection legislation. So I think there is a real need to look at how we can learn from each other and coordinate at say, national and international level to regulate the environment. So thank you.